I married Arthur when I was 23 and honestly thought I'd hit the jackpot. He had this steady job in accounting, owned his own house, drove a reliable car that he actually washed every weekend like some kind of ritual. My friends were all dating these losers who couldn't hold down jobs or lived with their parents. And here I was with a guy who had his life completely together. Sure, he wasn't the most exciting person in the world, but excitement doesn't pay the bills, right? At least that's what I told myself back then. The first couple years were fine, I guess. Arthur did his thing, I did mine, and we had this comfortable routine going. He'd come home from work, we'd eat dinner while watching TV, maybe go out on weekends to some chain restaurant where he'd spend 10 minutes analyzing the menu like he was choosing a college major. I kept thinking this was just temporary, that eventually we'd do something more interesting with our lives, travel somewhere exotic, or buy a bigger house, or just have some kind of adventure. But Arthur seemed perfectly content with his little bubble of predictability. When I got pregnant with Caleb, Arthur was over the moon. You'd think I was carrying the next Messiah or something, the way he fussed over me. Suddenly, I'm getting foot rubs every night, and he's reading pregnancy books like he's studying for finals. For a while, I actually enjoyed all the attention. Someone was finally treating me like I was special, even if it took getting pregnant to make it happen. The whole pregnancy thing was kind of nice, actually. People holding doors for me, letting me cut in line, Arthur bringing me ice cream at midnight without complaining. But then Caleb was born and reality hit pretty hard. Don't get me wrong, I love my son, but nobody tells you how mind-numbing it is to be stuck at home all day with a baby. Arthur would leave for work every morning, looking all put together in his pressed shirts, heading off to have adult conversations and eat lunch wherever he wanted. While I'm sitting there in spit-up-covered pajamas, trying to figure out why the baby won't stop crying. I started counting down the days until my maternity leave was over because I was going stir-crazy in that house. Going back to work felt like coming back to life. Suddenly, I'm wearing real clothes again, talking to grown-ups about something other than diaper brands and sleep schedules. And that's when I met Julian. He was this new guy in the marketing department, probably about my age, but way more confident than Arthur had ever been. Julian actually noticed things like when I got my hair cut or wore a new dress. He'd make these little comments that weren't inappropriate exactly, but they made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in forever. At first, it was just friendly conversation by the coffee machine or whatever. But Julian had this way of making everything seem more interesting. He'd tell these stories about places he'd traveled or restaurants he'd been to, and I found myself looking forward to running into him every day. Arthur would pick me up from work sometimes, and I'd see Julian in the parking lot. And the contrast was just painful. There's Arthur in his sensible sedan with his NPR station playing, and there's Julian getting into his sports car looking like he actually enjoyed his life. I started staying late at work sometimes, just to have an excuse to talk to Julian without other people around. We'd grab drinks after work occasionally, and he'd listen to me complain about how boring my life had become. Julian got it, you know. He understood that I was meant for more than just being some suburban mom who gets excited about grocery store sales. Arthur never listened to me like that. When I tried to talk to Arthur about feeling trapped or wanting to do something different with our lives, he'd just suggest we refinance the mortgage or something equally thrilling. The physical thing with Julian started gradually. First, it was just longer hugs, then maybe his hand would touch mine when we were talking. I knew it was heading somewhere. And honestly, I didn't want to stop it. For the first time in years, someone was making me feel attractive and interesting and alive. Arthur barely looked up from his laptop most evenings. But Julian would send me these texts that made me feel like I was worth pursuing. I deserved to feel that way, didn't I? When Julian and I finally hooked up, it was like this whole part of myself that I'd forgotten about came rushing back. He made me remember what it felt like to be desired, to be someone's priority instead of just another responsibility on a list. We started meeting at hotels during lunch breaks, and I felt like I was finally living again instead of just existing. Arthur was so clueless, he didn't even notice when I started coming home from work, happier and more energetic than I'd been in months. I got a little careless, I'll admit that. I started working late more often, took longer lunch breaks, spent more time on my phone texting, but Arthur was so wrapped up in his own routine that I figured he wouldn't notice anyway. The man could go 3 days without really looking at me, so why would he suddenly start paying attention now? I even started dressing better for work, buying new lingerie, taking more care with my makeup. If Arthur had been any kind of husband, he would have wondered who I was trying to impress. But of course, Arthur had to pick the worst possible time to start being observant. He started asking questions about why I was working so much overtime, why I seemed distracted during dinner, why I was always checking my phone. I tried to explain that I was just trying to advance my career, maybe get a promotion so we could have a better life. But he kept pushing. It was like he wanted to find something wrong, like he couldn't just be happy that his wife was finally feeling good about herself again. When Arthur told me he had to go out of town for 3 days for some work conference, I saw it as a sign. Finally, some space to breathe without him hovering around asking questions about every little thing. Julian and I had been talking about wanting more time together, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. I even encouraged Arthur to go, told him it would be good for his career, practically pushed him out the door with his suitcase. The first day Arthur was gone, Julian came over after work, and it was incredible. We ordered takeout, drank wine, watched movies on the couch like a real couple. For a few hours, I could pretend this was my actual life instead of the boring existence I'd been stuck in. We talked about what it would be like if we were together for real, if I didn't have all these obligations holding me back. Julian made me feel like anything was possible. The second day, Julian came over again and we were in the bedroom when I heard the front door open downstairs. For a second, I thought maybe it was a break-in or something, because Arthur wasn't supposed to be back until the next day. But then I heard his voice calling my name, and I swear my heart stopped. Julian was already grabbing his clothes, looking around the room like a trapped animal. I told him to hide in the closet or under the bed, but he was panicking and said he was going out the window. I couldn't believe it when Julian actually climbed out our second-story bedroom window, like some teenager sneaking out past curfew. There I am trying to throw on clothes and make the bed look normal while my lover is literally escaping through the window. By the time Arthur made it upstairs, I was sitting on the bed in my robe, trying to look like I'd just been taking a nap. Arthur stood there in the doorway, looking around the room with this weird expression on his face. He kept saying he thought he heard voices, asking if someone was in the house with me. I told him he was being ridiculous, that I'd been sleeping, and he probably just heard the TV downstairs. But he kept pushing, saying he was sure he'd seen someone jump out of our bedroom window from the driveway. The whole thing was so absurd I almost started laughing. "Which guy?" I asked him. "There is no man in here. You're imagining things." I mean, what was I supposed to say? "Yes, honey. You just missed my boyfriend climbing out our window half naked." Arthur was clearly having some kind of paranoid episode, probably feeling guilty about leaving town and trying to project that onto me. I'd heard about this kind of thing happening to couples. The guilty party starts imagining their partner is doing exactly what they wish they could do. But Arthur wouldn't let it go. He kept walking around the house looking for evidence of some imaginary intruder, checking the locks on all the doors, even going outside to look under the bedroom window. I followed him around trying to calm him down, explaining that he was obviously stressed from work and seeing things that weren't there. The man was clearly having some kind of breakdown, and instead of getting help, he was taking it out on me. The next few days were absolutely horrible. Arthur wouldn't stop interrogating me about what happened while he was gone, who I'd been talking to on the phone, why I seemed different lately. He went through this whole paranoid routine, checking my phone records, asking me about every single person I worked with. I tried to be patient with him because obviously he was going through something, but his accusations were getting more and more insulting. He called me a liar, said I was cheating on him, claimed I was trying to drive him crazy by denying what he'd seen. The irony was incredible. Here I am trying to hold our marriage together while he's having some kind of mental health crisis, and somehow I'm the bad guy. I told him he was being insecure, crazy, paranoid, that his jealousy was going to destroy our family if he didn't get it under control. Then Arthur really lost it and started demanding I take a paternity test to prove Caleb was his son. I mean, can you imagine? The man I'd been married to for 5 years, who was there when Caleb was born, suddenly deciding his own child might not be his just because he was having trust issues. I looked at him and said, "Keep guessing." Because honestly, what kind of question was that? Did he think he had the balls to bear a child? The whole thing was so offensive I couldn't even process it. I realized I couldn't stay in that house with someone who was clearly having a complete mental breakdown. Arthur was becoming increasingly hostile and paranoid, making these wild accusations, treating me like I was some kind of criminal, instead of his wife who'd been putting up with his boring lifestyle for 5 years. When Julian offered to let me and Caleb stay with him temporarily, it seemed like the obvious solution. At least there I'd be with someone who actually trusted and respected me. Moving in with Julian felt like finally stepping into the life I was supposed to have. He had this great apartment with modern furniture and actual artwork on the walls, not just family photos and motivational posters like Arthur's house. Julian cooked real food, not frozen dinners. And he had friends who were interesting and fun to be around. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living instead of just surviving. The divorce went through pretty quickly since Arthur didn't want to fight about anything. I took full custody of Caleb, and didn't even ask for child support because I wanted to prove I could take care of my son without Arthur's help. Julian was making good money and he seemed committed to building a life with us, so I figured we'd be fine financially. Plus, I didn't want to give Arthur any excuse to stay involved in our lives more than necessary. But after a few months, Julian started acting weird. He'd make these comments about how expensive it was to support a family, or how he missed having his own space, or how Caleb was having trouble adjusting to the changes. I tried to explain that these things take time, that we just needed to be patient while we all figured out our new normal. But Julian was becoming distant and critical, finding fault with everything I did. The breaking point came when Julian said he thought maybe we'd moved too fast, that he wasn't ready for the responsibility of being a stepfather. After everything I'd given up for him, everything I'd risked to be with him, he was getting cold feet because being with me required some actual commitment. I couldn't believe I'd left my marriage for someone who turned out to be just as selfish as Arthur, except in a completely different way. When Julian kicked us out, I was devastated but not entirely surprised. Men always do this. They pursue you and make all these promises, but the minute you actually need them to step up, they disappear. I found a small apartment across town and tried to make it work on my own, but single motherhood is expensive and my job barely covered rent and childcare. I started reaching out to guys I'd met over the years just looking for some temporary help while I got back on my feet. It's amazing how quickly people judge you when you're struggling. These same men who used to fall all over themselves, trying to get my attention, suddenly acted like I was asking for the world when I needed a little financial support. I wasn't asking for handouts. I was asking for help during a difficult time. The kind of help anyone would need if they found themselves suddenly single with a child to support. I ended up moving around a lot over the next few years, staying with different people when I could, trying to find stable work and housing. Caleb was getting older and asking more questions about why we kept moving, why we couldn't just go home to Arthur's house, why his life was so different from other kids at school. I tried to explain that sometimes adults have to make difficult choices, and that his father had chosen not to be part of our lives anymore. After 3 years of struggling, I finally decided I had to swallow my pride and ask Arthur for help. Not for me, but for Caleb. Whatever problems Arthur and I had, Caleb was still his son and deserved support from both his parents. I knew where Arthur worked, so I went there one day to try to have a reasonable conversation about him stepping up financially. Arthur acted like I was some kind of criminal showing up at his workplace. He had security escort me out like I was threatening him or something when all I wanted was to talk about our son's needs. I couldn't believe how cold he'd become. How he could just walk away from his responsibilities like that. "You just walked away," I told him. "How could you leave your son like that?" Since Arthur wouldn't listen to reason, I decided to reach out to his mother. She'd always been nice to me, and I thought maybe she could talk some sense into him about helping with Caleb's expenses. When I showed up at her house with Caleb, she was so happy to see her grandson. It broke my heart that she'd been kept away from him for so long just because Arthur was holding grudges. I explained to Arthur's mother how difficult things had been, how I'd been trying to raise Caleb on my own without any support from his father. She was sympathetic and understanding, the way family should be when someone is going through a hard time. She gave me some money to help with immediate expenses and said she'd talk to Arthur about doing the right thing for his son. I ended up having several conversations with Arthur's mother over the next few weeks. She wanted to understand what had happened between Arthur and me, why our marriage had fallen apart so suddenly. I finally told her the truth about Julian, about how I'd made a mistake. But that didn't change the fact that Caleb needed support from his father. She appreciated my honesty and said she'd continue helping while she worked on convincing Arthur to step up. But then Arthur's mother started asking more questions, wanting details about the timeline of my relationship with Julian, when exactly things had started between us. I could tell she was getting suspicious about Caleb's paternity, probably because Arthur had been filling her head with the same paranoid theories he'd been obsessing over. I assured her that Caleb was definitely Arthur's son, that the timing made it impossible for there to be any question about that. The last time I saw Arthur's mother, she seemed different, less warm, more distant. She gave me some cash and said it would probably be the last time she could help, that Arthur was threatening to cut off contact with her if she kept giving me money. I could tell she was torn between wanting to help her grandson and keeping peace with her son. So, I didn't push, but I did take a few small valuable items from her house, things she probably wouldn't even miss, just to help cover expenses until I could figure out another solution. I had to leave town after that because Arthur's family was making things difficult, threatening to call police and making it sound like I was some kind of criminal just for asking for help supporting my child. I found out later that multiple people had filed complaints against me, claiming I'd stolen from them or manipulated them somehow. It was unbelievable how quickly people turned against me when they didn't want to take responsibility for their own choices. The most ridiculous part was when this guy Mike contacted Arthur, claiming that I'd told him he was Caleb's father, too. Mike was someone I dated briefly years ago, and apparently, he'd gotten some crazy idea that Caleb might be his son. He even claimed he'd done a paternity test that proved Caleb wasn't his. Like, that was supposed to mean something. I never told Mike he was Caleb's father. He came up with that idea on his own because he wanted to feel important. Now, everyone's acting like I'm this master manipulator who's been lying to everyone about everything, when the truth is, I've been trying to survive in a world where men make promises they don't keep and then blame women when things get complicated. Arthur abandoned his family. Julian kicked us out when things got real. And a bunch of other guys I barely knew are making up stories to avoid taking any responsibility for their own actions. I'm currently staying somewhere safe while I figure out my next move. Caleb deserves better than this chaos, and I'm going to make sure he gets it. Everyone wants to paint me as the villain in this story, but I know the truth. I'm a mother doing whatever it takes to provide for her child, while a bunch of men who made commitments to me are trying to rewrite history to make themselves look better. The legal system is clearly biased against women in my situation. They take the word of men over mothers. They assume the worst about women who've had to make difficult choices, and they don't care about the welfare of children caught in the middle. But I'm not giving up. Caleb needs someone to fight for him, and I'm the only one who's been there for him consistently through all of this. Arthur thinks he can just pretend Caleb doesn't exist, but biology doesn't work that way. Julian thinks he can use me and then throw me away when it's convenient. But actions have consequences. All these men think they can just walk away from their responsibilities. But I'm still here, still taking care of the child they all want to deny. That has to count for something. I've learned that you can't depend on anyone but yourself in this world. People will make promises they don't intend to keep. They'll turn on you the minute you need their help, and they'll blame you for their own failures. But I'm stronger than they think I am. And I'm not going to let them destroy my life or my son's future. We'll figure this out just like we always have, because that's what survivors do. The truth always comes out eventually. And when it does, everyone will see who the real villains are in this story. It's not the mother who's been fighting for her child against impossible odds. It's the men who made promises they didn't keep, who abandoned their responsibilities when things got difficult, who chose their own convenience over doing what's right. I can live with my choices because I know I've been fighting for my family. I'm not sure they can say the same.